Zac Clark is the founder and executive director of the Home More Project, a California nonprofit serving people experiencing homelessness through direct outreach, education, and innovative housing solutions. He founded the organization while still a freshman in college, growing it into a statewide nonprofit that has impacted thousands of people experiencing homelessness across California. He recently earned his master's in urban and regional planning from UCLA, where his research focuses on one of the least understood questions in homelessness: why people move between counties while unhoused. Through interviews across more than 40 California counties, he's working to better understand how policy, services, family, and opportunity shape these decisions. Thank you so much for joining me today, Zac Clark.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I want to start with your personal journey, how you came into this field. You founded the Home More Project while you were still in college. What first motivated you to begin working in homelessness, and why did you decide to build an organization instead of just volunteering?
Yeah, I came across the country. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and I moved across the country in 2019 to study at the University of San Francisco. I studied marketing and international business. And my aspiration at the time was to work in startups or in tech, and that was part of my decision to come to the Bay Area. And when I got there, it was 2019, just months before the pandemic had began. And so in March 2020, we had left on spring break. And within a few weeks, we got emails that said, you need to be out of your dorms by next week. And so I had to scramble pretty quickly to find somewhere to live. And I was back home with my family. And so I just kind of did some online apartment hunting. I don't recommend that for anyone who's not. Don't pick an apartment sight unseen. Um, and and so I showed up, and my apartment was in the Tenderloin, which I hadn't really heard of this neighborhood. And so I will never forget turning onto my street and seeing nothing but encampments. And I was like, 18-year-old kid from Georgia. This was something that I was not super familiar with. And so I ended up living there for about 4 years. And in a really kind of odd way, I was sort of a fly on the wall for encampments. I mean, I saw, dozens of overdoses, rapes, sexual assaults. I mean, a lot of really heavy stuff that I didn't anticipate seeing by living there initially. But there was also a lot of good things, and I saw, friendships form. I saw how, people interacted and kept each other safe and despite the circumstances. So, I got really passionate about talking to people who were unhoused outside my building, and, that was really the catalyst of, like, making me realize I don't think there's anything more important to be working on than, the challenge of homelessness today.
Was there any specific conversation or experience that completely changed how you viewed homelessness and really pushed you towards becoming interested in that field?
Yeah, there was a very particular story, and I've shared it many times before. But I was, I think it was Thanksgiving actually, and I was passing out some food, just kind of made some lunch bags and was walking around and passing out food, and I had met this man named Dave, and he had no shoes, he had his hoodie on, um, a backpack that was pretty beaten up, and our conversation was very brief. But as I was walking away, he had called out and he had asked, "Can you see if my mother passed away?" That was the question that he had asked to me. And I was 19. I had no background in this work, and I said, "Sure. What do I need to do?" And so he gave me the name of his sister, and it was one of those rare times when you look someone up and the number was actually correct. And so it went to her voicemail. She didn't answer. A few hours later that evening, I get a call from the family's attorney, and he says, "We've been looking all over for Dave." He confirmed that his mother did pass away, and he also mentioned that, if you see Dave again, his mom left him $40,000 in an inheritance that he had no idea about. And I think that story resonated with me so much because so much of, people's journey of being homeless or their journey out of being homeless is very circumstantial, right? And you think about if he had a cell phone that was operating that the attorney could contact him at, or if they just simply knew where he was, he would have access to $40,000, which I presume would end homelessness, at least in the, immediate short term. So I think again, it resonated so much because there are certainly common threads that we see, but at the end of the day, it's a deeply unique circumstance for people, and how everything kind of blends together to create the perfect storm for someone to be without housing. It looks very different for every person. So I think that was one of the things that really kind of opened my eyes, that this isn't just the standard things that you hear in the media where everybody's addicted, or just the things that are rather insensitive and inhumane. So yeah.
Wow, and from that one conversation on Thanksgiving to now having, impacted and sort of worked directly with thousands of people experiencing homelessness, did you have any perspectives or any ideas before getting into this field that have now changed, with your work on the ground?
Yeah, I think I think one of the interesting things about homelessness is that it's so visual, right? And I think the unfair part about it is we see a very small subset of the population who are unsheltered and, in some cases might suffer from severe addiction or mental health issues. And we see, you know, that subset of the population, and we make generalizations about the entire population. And, the reality is that majority of our unhoused population are sheltered or living in vehicles. They're not seen. And so I think it's, you know, it- it's easy to look at the one gentleman on the corner who's, overdosing and saying that, oh, well, everybody who's homeless is addicted and, lazy, and all these kind of negative narratives, which I believe are mostly untrue. And so I think that's kind of one of the things that when you get up under the hood and you start meeting people, I think one of the greatest realizations that I've had is there's a lot of people who just simply never really had a chance. Whether they were born into addicted parents or abusive parents, whether they were born into a situation where they had no parents or family. And it's kind of hard if we put ourselves in those shoes. It's kind of hard to imagine a different outcome. Like how else could someone find their way? And so I think when I started, the the common theme that you think about is like, okay, someone's in a house, they lose that house for whatever reason, they lose a job or, whatever, and then now they're homeless. Like just this very basic path. But the reality is that it one looks very different for everyone, but two, there's many, many layers to how someone ends up maybe at a shelter or in an encampment, right? Maybe it's they're with their family and there's a domestic violence case and then they seek shelter, and these things kind of spiral and take shape over time. So I think I would summarize to say that one, it's it's a deeply unique circumstance. And before doing this work, I thought it was, pretty streamlined for everyone else.
Now, I want to ask you a question about the media. I mean, you talked about how there's a certain narrative around how people, generalize that the one person who may be overdosing on the street. Now, one thing I've seen and I've also seen on the Invisible People's podcast, which Mark Horvath runs, is that this strive to sort of change the narrative and change the perspective people have around homelessness, and that starts presumably with the media. And so right now, I think it's fair to say that there's this idea and this sort of one story that runs, which is that that one person, that one news headline of a homeless person that attacked someone or was crazy or was or had overdosed, that takes over the whole sort of headline and that colors people's perceptions of the actual issue. How do you suggest the industry goes about changing that towards a idea that might be slightly more accurate or reflective of what we're actually seeing?
Hmm, it's a good question. I think I come at it from a like more of a humanitarian standpoint, which is to acknowledge that, people experiencing homelessness are still our neighbors. And, you know, I presume at one point they were our housed neighbors. And they're our community members. And so I think, you're exactly right. And so much of this work is just about buy-in from the community, right? You think about new housing construction, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point, but we're working on our first housing project. And so much of that is, you can have money, you can have buy-in from the council and board of supervisors, et cetera. But if the community doesn't back it and they speak out against it, it's really hard to get it done. And so much of this work is just having buy-in from the community. Um, and the media at times can make that very challenging. So I think a big part of what we try to advocate at my organization is sharing those stories. And it's sometimes a little bit of a dance because we don't want to come across as being, performative or just using. I mean, there's a lot of that on TikTok and everything else right now, as I'm sure you've seen. But to me, I think the pathway to getting things done is by being transparent about, who who is currently unsheltered. What are their stories? What led them to this situation? What are their aspirations? And I think that those kinds of questions and ideas are a lot more humanistic than just simply saying someone is addicted to heroin and why should we help them, right? And I think that the other piece too, just being like very transparent, is there are a lot of people who are housed that suffer from addictions, right? We all have problems. I mean, I have problems. Thankfully I'm not, I don't suffer from uh, any severe addictions, but we all have problems. And I think coining this population on being, drug addicted when there are a lot of people who are housed that have a drug addictions and such. So I think that gets way overblown in the media and how we talk about this population. Um, yeah.
And you brought something up that I want to delve into a little bit further, which is that the idea of TikTok and Instagram and these sort of newfound versions of like short form content media that has sort of taken off in the last couple of years with the sort of next couple of generations that are coming versus, the CNN, Wall Street Journal, BBC that we see that has existed for a longer period of time, more long form, more, structured, formal, news focused. Do you think there's a difference between how the media, pushes out the homeless narrative or how it's perceived, in the difference of long form versus short form content, as we'll see, like
Mm.
versus like Instagram versus maybe like CNN?
That's a good question. I would say the long form media, it certainly depends on what media you're consuming, right? What channels or whatever. That certainly depends a lot. I think comparing the long form and the short form, that's a good question. I think that what I would say is the short form content on TikTok. How many times have I viewed content about homelessness on there? And I'm not saying maybe from an organization, but just from a general content creator. How many times have I viewed that and said, this is someone doing it for the right reasons and this comes across as authentic? I think very little. Like I just very little. And there's even stuff that we've put out that I kind of look back on and I go, yeah, this just comes across like we're trying to get clicks or go viral or whatever else. So I think on one hand, I would be I want to acknowledge it. It is a tricky fine line in this work because if you aren't posting about it, are you really doing it? I mean, that's, you know, that's of course not the case, but in the eyes of the, funders and media and everything else, like they want to see that you're doing this work. And so it's a tricky line, I'll acknowledge. But I think how can we do TikTok in a authentic and in the least performative way? Um, I'm not so sure I've seen a lot of that great content. I don't know. Have you? Can I put it back to you? Have you seen stuff that? Yeah.
I have I have not. I'll have to agree with you on this one. I know I used to release like short clips of my podcast on Instagram, and I tried to make those as genuine as possible. They were just short clips, nothing more, nothing less, not like a I but when one does that, one doesn't get sort of like the sort of high click rates and the views that, one wants to see. I've seen some people, I'm forgetting the channel's name, but there is someone who films, and he basically goes around and, goes to restaurants and just buys, like, 100, I don't know, boxes of food and then just gives them out to the homeless, and I think that is probably the most sort of, like, going viral sort of trends I've seen in terms of the unhoused space or food insecure space. Um, I one could argue possibly that it's slightly performative, but I don't really see that. I think it's genuinely, them trying to do their best, and those have gone. I've seen those appear on my feed, and those have done, quite well in terms of views. But less so policy, like policy related things, or things that are like slightly more complicated and more focused on the actual like the crux of what is going on at like the legal level. Those I've never seen. I think it's more so showing the humanity, which I think is arguably maybe more necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think thinking back to your question now, like there's a big difference between the type of content, right? Is it content that's intended to be, um, informative in a way that maybe influences policy versus something that's more of a feel good story, and so I think the feel good stories there's a lot of,
Mhm.
and it's not to say that some don't still maybe come across a little. I'm not sure, um, but yeah, it's a very and I'm sure we'll get into in the next few sections, like there it's a very diverse population and issue, and there's many ways to look at it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I completely agree in terms of the many different ways people are looking at it. And for starters, I want to focus on how you're looking at it and what you've done. And so, as I mentioned in the bio, you founded the Homeward Project. And so, I want you to see if you could take a time to explain what that is. And do you have any certain lessons or key takeaways you have from building an organization from scratch?
Yeah, definitely. So I founded this organization in July of 2020, shortly after, moving into my apartment there in the Tenderloin, and it took many years to kind of take shape and figure out, like, this is what I wanted to do and stuff like that, but in 2021, I got the idea to do housing, and I was like convinced that if we build more housing, this is the solution to homelessness. I want to be a part of that front line. And so, I was 19. I think I had about $400 in my checking account, and I was like, okay, how am I going to reasonably get into building housing? And so I took a step back and I thought about, like, what are some of the things that I could do to get into the community right now, build trust, and most importantly, learn directly from people who are experiencing homelessness. And my idea was to create a product. I've always been very interested in entrepreneurship and product creation, and so uh, in 2021, we began prototyping what's called the makeshift traveler. And that is a hard shell solar powered backpack that we selfishly like to think is the last backpack someone who's unsheltered will ever need. And so it's hard shell, very durable, uh, lasts. I still get emails from people over the years that hey, I still have your backpack and it works great. And I'm like, on one hand, I wish you were housed, but at least if you're not, glad the pack's working. And so that was our first program. And um, you know, I think above all else, it really helped me get out there and dispel some of these, myths and stereotypes that I think a lot of people probably have without having talked to someone who's homeless. Um, so that was a really, and it's still a great program. This year we'll distribute about 3,000 packs across 30 cities in California, 5 different states. Um, so we're really continuing to try to grow and scale up that program. But in addition to that, we also run an education program that has a few publications. We have a blog, we do some films. And then, as I mentioned previously, we're starting to get into housing development as well. Um, and I know we'll get into that a bit later. So, as far as lessons, I feel like there's many lessons I could share. I'll start with the least exciting one first, which is about money. Um, And I think what I would do is I'm not gonna give the boring or the super boring example, which is, you need to raise money, but I'll give the less boring example, which is I think if you're building an organization, you need to be very clear about, like, what is the financial model, right? How does it sustain itself? Um, who's gonna pay into it? And those are questions that, you know, I think a lot of people don't think about in the nonprofit space. I mean, the amount of people who still, like adults, who say, like, is that a job? Like, do you get paid? Like, do you, I think that there's a big misconception about the nonprofit space in general. Um, but I think being very clear about the financial model and how the organization is going to sustain itself. And so we've tried to do that by diversifying our programs. Each of those financial models, like the backpack, of course, people either purchase or they fund through grants, mostly like private foundations. Our housing program is mostly state and government funding, and our education program is mostly individuals. So I think being very clear about how the organization is going to sustain itself. And then the other thing I would say is, particularly if you're a founder, thinking about, like, where do I want to be in 10 years? And that will certainly evolve as you build the organization. But when I started in 2021, my vision was 30 employees, doing all these projects and things. And over the years, partly because of the volatility of being in the nonprofit space, I've completely reshaped that. And, now I see our team being 7 people who can wear all the hats, do a lot of things, and are just generally really good, smart people. And and by doing that, you're more efficient and everything else. So I think maybe that's not the most interesting answer, but those are some of the big lessons I'm thinking about a lot right now.
And one thing that is especially interesting to me is that the Homework Project doesn't focus on just food or just housing or just education. It has multiple different fronts upon which it sort of goes to either solve or mitigate homelessness. And why was that important? Why did you feel the need to build something on multiple fronts versus, I think what might be the slightly more popular notion, at least there has been, is trying to focus on one front and really make sure that you take care of that.
Yeah, so when I started, I think it was really important for me to kind of do something a bit like innovative and out of the box. And I think selfishly, my thought was, if I'm going to put a lot of time and effort into building this organization, I want to try something new, and I think at least in San Francisco, a lot of the bases were covered. I mean, we have the food bank, the shelters, the, church groups and the high school groups that go out and give things and stuff like that. So I think I really wanted to try to create something that was very unique and would catch people's eyes, and I think also build trust. When we distribute our packs, people are very appreciative of the backpacks being, we don't sell them to people who are without house, or I'm sorry, to people who have housing. And so, we design this specifically for people who are unsheltered. And I think that transparency, it builds trust. Um, and so I think it was very intentional to try to be different. Um, yeah.
And while, being different and developing all these multiple fronts that, now we're all succeeding and really just building a organization from the ground up, um, and being fairly young relative to the other people in this space, what were sort of the challenges that you faced, whether it's when working with other foundations, other nonprofits, if you work with any state, municipal, or local government officials, what were some of the challenges you faced and how'd you resolve them?
Yeah. Well, I think it's it's interesting as a young founder. I mean, of course, I don't know how many people ignored my email because they saw that I was, 20 years old or whatever it is. But my overwhelming reaction is that most people appreciated that we were younger, and and I think it's funny how kind of the scale of age is because now I'm 25, and I feel like the whole young thing, it still applies in certain contexts, but when you're working with, municipalities or nonprofits for many years, they don't really care that I'm young anymore. It's like, "Hey, this is kind of the deal," things like that. So I think when you're early on, you're playing a little bit with house money, and in that you're young, you can make some foolish mistakes, people will, understand. But I think a lot of people wanted to get behind the fact that we were, or at the time it was just myself, but 20-year-old that had built this product and wanted to put it out there. So I think the majority is it was there were positives, but I think the challenges were probably more on the fundraising side, where a lot of more established foundations didn't want to give money to an organization that had no full-time employees. We were student led. uh, our budget at the time was probably like $100,000. So we were very small. And so I think naturally in any startup, regardless of for profit or nonprofit, there are some pros to being early on and small, and there's also some cons. Um, yeah.
I want to now focus on something that you've mentioned throughout the podcast, and that you spend your master's doing, which is your research in homelessness mobility, and then later getting into the housing solution that you're now starting to develop through the Home More project. And so, could you take us through what your research was, what was it about, and why did you realize that it was such an important question to look into?
Yeah. Well, I think for one, um, movement amongst the unhoused population is very controversial. And, I think that there's one kind of ideology, particularly in our big cities, where people believe that everybody who's homeless there is from somewhere else. Like, so I think that's kind of a standard thing. You also hear that in the rural communities that, oh, these people can't be from here, they're busing them in, right? We hear those things a lot. And so I want to at least preface by saying that the research I did at UCLA was not to support any of those kinds of ideologies. But, the just kind of a few numbers. In California, there's about 180,000 people who are homeless. And uh, the guiding statistic that I used for this research project was that UCSF in their statewide study a few years ago noted that 20% of people were currently homeless in a county in which they were not last housed. In other words, they moved. And so while 20% isn't the majority, nor is it, significant, it's still about 40,000 people in California who have moved counties, which is kind of a lot of people. And so, that was the target population of who I wanted to interview and try to understand, like, what are these reasons that make people move? And you hear a lot about, uh, kind of like you build it and they come sort of mentality. I think there's a lot of good research on debunking that idea, where if you build a shelter, it's not going to attract people to live there. Um, some of those stories did come up in the interviews, but overwhelmingly, that's a pretty insignificant issue. But I think, like, as far as why I wanted to do the project, I think two things. One, I agree with what you said. It's a very under researched and misunderstood topic. And then I think two, I wanted to create it in a geographic scope that would allow me to travel and see homelessness across the state. So in the project, I visited over 40 counties. Keep in mind, it's yeah, sort of making cameo appearances like 3 to 4 counties in a day sometimes, just cranking out interviews and such. But I wanted to interview people in all these different counties. And as I can get into as well, I think one of the biggest findings that I had was that, like, homelessness is not unique to our metropolitan areas, which is something that I think conceptually most of us presume, but empirically it is true. And in my opinion, there's 58 counties in California, and in my opinion, I would say probably about 50 to 52 would describe themselves as having significant unhoused populations. And I think that's something that as a state we have to grapple with. Um, so yeah, I think all those different ideas and such, also personally wanting to travel and share my organization and get out there, culminated into this larger thesis project.
And you often say that where someone ends up after moving is influenced by much more than just health availability. I know you talked about some of the findings that you looked at, which was 50 to 52 of the counties have a significant homelessness population. Was there any findings that you learned from your interviews that genuinely surprised you, or were there any factors that you uncovered that caused people to move that are stronger than housing availability?
Yeah, the one that I don't know if it was a surprise in the moment, but the one consistent finding was that people move because of perception of social networks and family opportunities. And social networks in homeless services, it can be a push and a pull, right? It can be a push where maybe you're fleeing an abusive relationship, maybe you need a fresh start, things like that. And then it's also a pull where the amount of stories that I heard of, oh, my uncle said that uh, I could stay with him, and then I stayed with him for 2 to 3 months, and then he didn't want me anymore, and so now I'm homeless and blank. That was a really common story that I heard a lot. And I think, on the the policy front, I think the interesting question that we have to ask is, you know, like, for example, in Humboldt County, I interviewed 3 people, and all 3 of them coincidentally were last housed in San Diego. And so I think the question we have to ask is, if all of these people uniquely arrived in Humboldt, whether it was social networks or whatever, is that Humboldt County's responsibility to house those folks? And I think that's an important question that we have to ask. And on one hand, I commend us as servants and everything, that we just serve people with open arms. But I think it does, in those kind of scenarios, it is interesting how people end up in certain places. And, I think it's not just limited to social networks. It's weather, the northern rural counties. I visited in January to March of 2025. And this is when a lot of these counties are doing point in time counts. And, point in time counts traditionally are done in January. And the reason is because that's when the shelters are anticipated to be at the highest capacity. And so you can reach more people. But in these rural communities, some of which snow, yes, it snows in California, um, you know, these rural communities complain because their point in time counts aren't accurate because a lot of people migrate south to get out of the cold. And so then your point in time is lower, your funding allocation is lower. And so, I think there's a lot of having lived in LA's of course got a lot of challenges. Those are at the front and center, but there are also a lot of nuances and challenges in these smaller communities too.
And one thing you mentioned earlier is that it's important whenever creating a foundation, organization, nonprofit, whatever it may be, to ask yourself, where do you want to be in years? And so I want to ask you that question, but I want to focus it specifically in a policy way because a lot of the work that you talked about, whether it's trying to look at how point in time counts are done, or seeing how the mobility of homeless people affects different counties differently, that at the end of the day, that should be resolved. I believe as a policy issue in terms of should this county have to take in these counties and house people, or how should they give services if they're receiving too many unhoused people. And so in 10 years, where do you want to be? How do you want to influence policymakers? What changes do you want to see?
Interesting. Hmm. I've got to think about this question. You know, I I'll be personal for a second. I'm the kind of person where I want to do everything, and that's probably how we come across as like all these. Like we have a kids book, we have a product, we're doing housing. I'm working on an oral history book, which I haven't talked about yet, but like it, it's probably how we come across as just a bunch of random ideas that I get while driving or in the shower, which is true. But I think where I want us to fit is I want to be on the practicing side of building housing and building communities where um, people feel safe and secure. And I'm happy to get into discussing housing now, but the niche that we're trying to carve out is looking at a lot of these rural communities that economically are distressed. Housing is very tired and limited, and communities are left behind. And our first housing projects in a small town called Wairika in Siskiyou County. It's 40 minutes south of the Oregon border. Everybody's confused by it with the other city called Eureka, which is much bigger. But we purchased about half of an acre of land for $50,000, pretty insignificant relative to like LA or San Francisco, of course. And this is a community that has one of the highest rates of homelessness in California relative to general population. So yeah, I mean, even more than San Francisco. So, these are communities that need these kinds of projects. And I think if it's one critique that I have of how we're constructing housing targeted at the unhoused population, I think that recently we've become obsessed with doing things at the lowest cost. Like when we talk about like solutions, we're like, this is only going to cost, or this is how we cut corners to do the cost. And I think what that signals is, you know, people who are experiencing homelessness are less than. And I think where we want to be is constructing communities and building housing that has nothing to do with someone's past of being without it. Um, and so, I can't share visually or anything, but I would encourage you all to go to our website and see our mock-ups and everything. But the inspiration I take from is are what are called cottage courts, which are these little communities that have 8 to 15 units, um, and so that's kind of the inspiration that we're taking for our project. It's targeted at homeless seniors, and yeah, I could go on and on, but so I think where I want to be in 10 years is building those communities, and I know there's a lot of work to do on the policy side. I think there's also a lot more smarter people who care about, you know, reading and researching. And I like research, but I wanna be on the side that's building things and moving people in. So uh, yeah. And it can change, it may evolve over the years.
And with this sort of model as you're building it and creating it, what are some of the challenges that you faced, or what is some of the positive feedback that you've heard so far, if any?
Hmm. Not to bring up the most, the low hanging fruit, but I mean the challenge is always is funding, right? And how does how do certain funding pieces come together to get the project done? And that's something that, hopefully, if you interview me again or next year, I'll maybe have some better information about that. Right now, it's how I look at it is it's kind of like it's a video game, and right now I'm trying to understand the controls of the game and what buttons to press. And once I figure that out, then I can understand the different levels to the game. And so a lot of this first project is just learning the controls and the buttons. So um, so yeah, I'm not sure about kind of the more intricate things of the project, but we are we just were awarded a $250,000 grant from the Delhi Web Foundation, which was huge in helping us do some of these kind of groundwork things for the project. And then we're fingers crossed waiting on a state grant for about $3 million that will be notified in November. So if we were to be awarded that, that would bring it home for us and get us there. So, but I think one other thing I would add too is one of the challenges with any of these projects is getting community buy-in. And I spend months and months, many visits, Zoom calls, meetings to meet with the city council, members of the board of supervisor, behavioral health, all these different stakeholders in the project. And so, it's really important that you build rapport and good relationships with those people. And so that takes a lot of time.
Wow, I mean, I commend you on the grant you already got, and I wish you the absolute best on the next grant. Um, but when it comes to, building ideas and one thing that piqued my interest is so that, the ideas come from, whether you're in a car ride or just sort of spontaneously while in the shower. And I think that really speaks to how, founding at a very basic level and entrepreneurship at a very basic level should work because it's about those ideas that you come up when you're not really thinking about ideas. Like it's just sort of like happens spontaneously. Um, that's how whether it was like the app initially or now the podcast, it just sort of like felt like something that like felt like the right thing to do, and I was just randomly, um, like I thought of the app like just sitting in my dining room after eating dinner like at 10 p.m. on summer. It's like it's just how it goes, and I think that's truly speaks to the sort of founding process. And so, you know, obviously with it comes many challenges, but I wish you the best as you continue to build these ideas. Now, on one of those ideas, which is the oral history book, um, I wanted to hear a little bit about that. I know you dropped that in. Is there, what is that? What are you trying to do with it? What's its goal?
Definitely. Yeah. I appreciate you asking me about that because that's what I'm spending a lot of my time on these days. And So the idea came from, uh, or it came out of my research at UCLA for my master's, where, in short, I traveled across California, went to these places. As I said, I was going to sometimes 3 or 4 counties in a single day. And so I was going to these places, but, beyond going to like the Chipotle or something, I wasn't really getting my hands in the community. And so I came back from that, few months trip and I thought, what if a lot of people finish school and then they take a year to backpack through Europe. And I was like, what if I take a year to just travel across California and collect stories of homelessness from every county? And so that was a random idea I started throwing across my, advisors at the time. And they were like, well, you have time to do that, I guess. And so, I ended up moving out of my apartment in July of 2025, and I've been living nomadically for the past year, doing some other things, spending time with some friends and family as well. But primarily, I've been traveling across California, collecting stories from mostly every county. I've only done about 25 so far, but the goal is to do every county. And so, the goal of the project is two things. One, as I've mentioned a few times during this podcast, geographic diversity I think is really important to me. And when you think about homelessness in California, you think about LA, San Francisco, et cetera, but you don't really think about, um, you know, Crescent City, which is the northernmost city and has the highest rate of homelessness in California, literally the highest rate.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and, you know, I can be happy to share the data and stuff. It's all over my LinkedIn too. But, yeah, and so of course, sheer numbers should matter more than rates in this kind of topic, but rates matter too. And so the the first thing is to show homelessness is not unique to our big cities. And then the second thing really gets at what I've touched on a lot throughout this podcast, which is the stories and the people. And so we're creating or we're doing about 45-minute interviews and then shrinking that down into a 1 to 2 page story for each person. And so we're doing 500 in somewhat representative amounts for each county based on their point in time counts. So, like Los Angeles is getting 25 stories, whereas, um, you know, Del Norte County is getting 10. So, um, and we're hoping the book will be published by the end of next year. We're having some early conversations with publishers now, and just kind of trying to figure out what the right medium is. So it's a huge passion project of mine. I think it's very important. And, hopefully I look back on this and it's published. We'll see.
Yeah, that'll be cool. Maybe I interview you sometime next year and you have a published book. It'd be great progress to hear about.
Yeah.
As we sort of wrap up and get to the sort of last questions of this podcast, I always try to ask like sort of questions about like looking forward and slightly, I guess, more fun and less structured questions.
Yeah.
So, for example, the first one that I want to ask you was: imagine you had the attention of every mayor in
Mm,
America for 5 minutes. What changes would you urge them to make when addressing homelessness? What would you use that 5 minutes for? What would you say?
Interesting. I feel like there's many different angles I could take on this. I'll say something different that I haven't really talked about a lot, which is I think I think data and information is very important. And, admittedly, we don't like my organization, we don't run any HMIS or any case management for people. So I'm not up under the hood in this area. But from what I've heard and observed, um, the data is extremely important. And I think what is challenging for many municipalities is that they simply don't know the full scope of homelessness in their own city. And I think this semi-annual point in time count that we do is not very informative and often doesn't match what organizations or the city have in HMIS and other databases. So I think I think one I would say making sure that the data is accurate and up to date. And I think on that line as well is, something that I've come to realize in a lot of my travels is that different municipalities have different ways of approaching solutions. And I think one of the best examples I can give is there's a small town called Red Bluff in Tehama County, north central California. And, I visit them a few times a year. And one of their ways of transitioning people into permanent housing is actually purchasing um, RVs and trailers for folks. And this isn't like a this isn't their only solution, but it's one of them. And for people who are interested in that lifestyle, uh, they they will do that for them, and they'll rent out, a I don't know all the lingo, but they'll rent out like a spot in an RV park or whatever for a certain amount of years to provide that stability for them. And so I think we can get creative about how people exit homelessness. And I would really encourage, people and municipalities to understand the desires of the population. And I think a certain part of our society right now would be like that's enabling and they shouldn't get to choose what they want and all these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, if we can understand what does success look like for you, I think that that can change how we approach solutions moving forward. So um, that was kind of a bit ambiguous, but I think that's something that is very important.
And again, back to the whole 10-year thing, if you had to predict, or if you could think or got what you wanted, how would homelessness look like in America in the next 10 years? I mean, obviously, if it was gone, that would be amazing, but like, focusing on practicality, what do you see for homelessness in America in the next 10 years?
Hmm. I wish I could say that I think it will get better, but I must admit, I think this year and the past few years will probably set us back a bit. And, and, I think I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to one, actually, I think one of Mark's podcasts um, and the nice lady that was on, I can't remember her name, but she had made a surprising comment where she said that she's surprised that there aren't more people that are homeless. And my initial reaction to that was, that's interesting. But as I thought about it, and as I've traveled to these different communities and such, it there are a lot of people who are, one health setback, one missed paycheck from entering that spiral into potentially being homeless. And and so, thinking about the next decade, I'm not sure. I mean, of course, I hope that things will reduce and we'll expand our capacity for services and housing and such. But it's very expensive. There's not one size that fits all, and it's hard to make a data driven prediction about the next decade. But that would be my summary.
And then as my last question, for anyone trying to get into the field, young founders or, young volunteers who want to do more, what advice do you have for them for the sort of next generation of homelessness advocates?
Get out there. Get out there. Um, yeah, I think it's really important. Uh, we're not big enough right now that I can have this policy at our organization, but I think every organization should have a policy where at least one day out of the week, you're out in the community and you're either doing outreach or meeting with people I think that that's very grounding and very important. And so for any students or young people, I'm sure many of them know this, and clearly you knew this, and you've rolled up your sleeves and gotten out there. But just be out there, be open, um, ask people about themselves, learn their story. Those kind of small things really, really make a huge difference. So get out there, volunteer, and if you start an organization or an effort, great. If you just show up every Saturday morning and give out food, that's equally as important. So,
Well, focusing on everyone else, making sure you tell their stories, getting out there. Those are definitely some of the main lessons that we've learned from this podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today, Zach. And I really appreciate all your experience and advice.
yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great.